right, welcome in. All right, we're going to start the next session in about 2 minutes time. Thank you. Taumata. If everybody could take their seats, we're just about to start the session. Thank you. Including you, Phil. Hurry up. Ina mana, ina reo, ina waka, ina iwi, he mihi mahara, tō koutou, tihei Māori ora. Kia ora tātou, ko mauna whau te mona, ko Waitemata te mo ana, ko heko te waka, ko e te hone Reidy, ko rangatira, ko hatomaka te whare tipuna, ko Reidy, ko tu ingoa, ko Ngāti Pākehā, ko tu iwi, ko e te rangatira, ko Fletcher. Good afternoon, my name is Reidy, and it gives me great privilege to lead this session this afternoon. Welcome to everyone. Water, or wai, is the life giver of all things. For Māori, water is so much more than what we call a resource. It's the lifeblood. It connects this generation with the tupuna ancestors who came before. It's not just physical, it is spiritual. Water is taonga. It's one's health, my health, your health. We're deeply connected to the health of our water in this country. For many of us, it's taken longer for us to come to that same understanding. Like me, you've grown up believing that this river would be swimmable, this water from the taps would be drinkable, that it would rain in winter or would play under the hose in the summertime. Our waste and storm water would magically disappear. And that understanding has changed in this country. Sadly today, more than 1 million New Zealanders do not have access to safe drinking water, and 34,000 of us get sick every year from drinking dirty water. Fletcher has sponsored this session of Rebuilding Nations because in no other sector Is it more important to build back better than in our Three Waters infrastructure, a sector under enormous pressure as funding needs grow, as we've heard today, larger and public expectations grow deeper? My job today is simply to introduce water experts from New Zealand and offshore to shape and share their experience as we start to shape our future of water in New Zealand collectively as one nation. And to kick us off on this water journey, we'll begin with this video from Tonkin and Taylor.
The best way to describe a Māori worldview on water is to start with the sentence that people sometimes ask you, who are you? Ko waikoe, which can also mean you are water. And the whakapapa and genealogical connection that describes. I think the other thing is, because it's so inherently connected to whakapapa and genealogy and who you are and where you've come from, that obligation to nurture nature is inherent in our connection to water bodies. And I think that sometimes that's why we struggle as Māori to talk about the well-being of water without talking about the well-being of people, because those two things are so inherently connected.
The reform process that the government is now undertaking has some very specific outcomes for community health. There are 2 or 3 outcomes that I'm really hoping that we will see from the process. The first of those is safe drinking water for all New Zealanders. The second of those is improved wastewater discharges to ensure that we have clean waterways. And thirdly, in regard to maintaining and improving swimmable watercourses for our future generations and mokopuna.
I think we shouldn't be afraid of the future. There's a lot of work to do. Because of Havelock North, we've been able to peel back the layers and start afresh in some respects. So the way that we conduct our business now is vastly different to what we did 4 years ago prior to Havelock North. We thought that everything was okay, but our community was getting sick. Our whole philosophy now is to ensure that that doesn't happen, such that our communities can feel safe, and we're doing everything to protect them.
When I was growing up, we had a soda spring that ran near the marae, and it was a really important source of water and a place to play as well. And doing this right to me means that my whānau is able to reclaim what the health of that waterway and other water sources used to be like, so that I'll be able to take my kids back there and put a bottle in a stream and be able to drink it.
Thank you, Tonkin Taylor, for that beautiful, thought-provoking start to our session. The Minister who is leading water reform for the Labour government is our new Foreign Minister, the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta. Unfortunately, due to the very recent death of a Northland Māori leader, Minister Mahuta has had to attend a tangi and can no longer be with us in person today, but will instead speak via video. The Minister has led from the front since the government first moved to reforming the way water is managed. She's been instrumental in bringing local councils into the water reform process and has put people and safety at the heart of the debate. The Minister has not shied away from asking the hard questions, but she speaks often of the need for collaboration as we try to find sustainable solutions to build capability and capacity in the water sector. As the Minister said in 2018, the biggest question is whether we are brave enough to move away from the status quo and be able to do things differently for the good of our country and for all communities. And I guess the answer is yes, Minister, we are brave enough. We'll now listen to the Minister via video link. Welcome to the Honourable Nanaia Mahuta.
E ngā mana e ngā reo e ngā kārangatanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the invitation to again take part in this annual hui about the important work of building our regions and planning the future of infrastructure here in New Zealand. I'm sorry I'm not able to be there in person, and I want to acknowledge Chief Executive John Ray, Chair Andrew Stevens and Infrastructure New Zealand staff for putting together the program for this symposium. I'd also like to acknowledge Sarah Lang for her work with the Women's Infrastructure Network, including her nomination last year for New Zealander of the Year award. There's some large changes underway in which you, as leaders of your industry, will play an important role. These include the RMA reforms, the government's urban growth and housing agendas, and a move to a more resilient and responsive infrastructure for greener growth and development. Today I'd like to focus on how the Three Waters Reform Program will make our Three Waters services economically and environmentally safe and sustainable, and support our aspiration to deliver a world-class Three Waters system for all New Zealanders no matter where they live. Water is integral to the natural and built environments that New Zealanders call home. A holistic, integrated view of this precious resource is important to me, and as Minister I have approached water reform in that light. It's clear that rather than piecemeal solutions, we need comprehensive, system-wide reform to achieve lasting benefits for our communities. The reforms will continue to require significant engagement between central government, local government, iwi and industry professionals like yourselves. This reform program has three main pou or pillars. Pou tuatahi, our water services bill. Our first pou has been to comprehensively reform the drinking water regulatory framework, combined with targeted improvements to wastewater and stormwater regulation. The Water Services Bill, which I introduced to the House in July, aims to ensure New Zealand's drinking water is consistent with international best practice while improving oversight and transparency of waste and stormwater networks. In keeping with our intent to approach water reform through a holistic lens, the Water Services Bill requires all persons to have functions or duties under this legislation to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai. Importantly, this will require councils to engage with tangata whenua in areas such as source water protection or water management decisions. I'm working to ensure this bill receives its first reading quickly when Parliament resumes, with the intention of referring the bill to Select Committee before Christmas. I encourage you to take the opportunity to have your say on the bill when it progresses to the Select Committee stage. Pou tuarua, Taumata Arowai. The second pou of our water reform agenda has been to create a new dedicated water services regulator called Taumata Arowai to monitor and enforce the entire drinking water system. I understand you will shortly hear more from Bill Bayfield, Establishment Chief Executive of Taumata Arowai, about his organisation's role. I expect Taumata Arowai to be a real-world modern regulator that ensures New Zealanders receive safe, acceptable drinking water and helps prevent adverse events from occurring, such as the Havelock North outbreak that resulted in the tragic loss of life. Regional councils will remain the primary regulators of storm and wastewater. However, given the interconnected nature of drinking water, wastewater and stormwater, Taumata Arowai will have an oversight role to promote better transparency and understanding of how these networks are performing. In carrying out this remit, Taumata Arowai will be guided by a Māori advisory group. This will assist the regulator on Māori interests and knowledge and how to give effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, mātauranga Māori, and ensure tikanga Māori is exercised. Pou tuatoru, service delivery reform. The third pou of our Three Waters mahi is reforming arrangements for the delivery of Three Waters services to our communities. We're faced with a Three Waters system that is under pressure across New Zealand, suffering from historic underinvestment, ageing infrastructure and all too common failure. This situation is compounded by increasing capital costs, the need to build resilience to climate change and natural hazards, and increasing community expectations for the quality and performance of water services. Current arrangements, particularly for smaller councils, are not well suited to meet these big challenges. Fundamental changes required to deliver long-term, enduring solutions. COVID-19 has now posed more immediate challenges. That is why in July this year, the Prime Minister announced a funding package of $761 million to local government to provide immediate post-COVID-19 stimulus to maintain and improve Three Waters infrastructure and to support reform of Three Waters service delivery arrangements. I understand that there is good progress towards getting these funds out the door and the associated projects underway. For the wider reform package, we've committed to partnering with local government, alongside iwi as our treaty partners, to look into the establishment of larger multi-regional water providers across the country. These entities would ultimately deliver more affordable, efficient, reliable and resilient water services, while significantly improving the safety and quality of drinking water and the performance of the waste and stormwater systems. You'll shortly hear from Tony Kelly, the Director of TasWater, about the reforms that Tasmania has undertaken in their water sector. This is just one of the international examples that we're looking at to inform our own reforms here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Our reforms represent a significant but necessary lifting of standards and requirements to make our drinking water safer and will provide a stable pipeline of work, delivering infrastructure upgrades and stimulating local economies. Our focus over the last few months has been on working with local government as our partners in this major reform program and iwi Māori as our treaty partners. I'm really aware that you as key figures in the infrastructure sector may not have had great visibility of what our work program is and where we're up to. I've asked my officials to set up several engagements with you before Christmas. This is our chance to achieve a lasting transformation, and we must ensure that we take our communities that we serve along with us. Let's together build a world-class water system that delivers lasting benefits for the people of Aotearoa, New Zealand. I wish you all the very best for the rest of your symposium. Nō reira, kei ngā iti, kei ngā rahi e whakamahi ana ngā mahi mō a tātou nei wai. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thank you, Minister, and it's very encouraging to hear the Minister talk about this as a system of services, connected system of services, which from an infrastructure perspective is challenging, but it's the only way to go. So we're now going to bring some Australians into the room. We've got a Trans-Tasman bubble here, but it's via video link. Tony Kelly has spent more than 40 years in the water industry, has been involved in major reforms including water utility mergers, corporatisation, contracting out, independent price regulation and privatisation. As Managing Director of Yarra Valley Water, he's transformed it into one of the most efficient water utilities in Australia with a global reputation for its environmental standards. He's been heavily involved in water charities, including inaugural chair of WaterAid Australia and as Director of WaterAid UK. Tony is a non-executive director of TasWater, a water and sewage utility which is owned by Tasmania's 29 local authorities. It hasn't been an easy journey for Tasmania as it has reformed the way it manages water. Tony will share with us what they've learned together and what we could replicate and what to avoid. Kia ora, Tony.
And set up what the Minister referred to as a world-class water industry structure. Whenever I've been involved in such reforms, I've always been conscious of trying to do the best thing for my state or indeed for the country, rather than what's good for my organisation. Many of you, I suspect, will be faced with the same dilemma over the coming months and years. I'm going to run you through a couple of models. The Melbourne model, which is typical of many of the models in Australia. I'm also going to run you through the Tasmanian model. I'm going to give you some of my personal views on what I think has worked. and draw some common threads as well. I think the key message I want to get across today to the audience is that there are many models in Australia, each one having been designed to meet the regional challenges, their own specific regional challenges. So there is no perfect model, and one is not necessarily better than the other. But there are some common themes, and I will bring those to your attention. Okay. So let's just flick through quickly the Melbourne model. The Melbourne model is, has been in place since 1995. Originally, it was a fully integrated, vertically integrated water entity. In the mid-90s, the state government of Victoria was busy selling energy utilities, privatising them. And their intention was that they would privatise water as well. So they set up the Melbourne structure with 3 retailers and a wholesaler with the intention of selling the retailers. Under that model, the state government initially was the shareholder, but of course the intention was that would transfer to the private sector. As it happened, the government did very well out of the sale of energy, and the rationale or the need to sell water to help balance their finances no longer existed. And also the community were not nearly as supportive of the privatisation of water as they were of energy. So the structure you see there on the right-hand side is a structure that exists today. Okay, this is giving you a diagrammatic of how the structure looks. So on the left-hand side, you've got Melbourne Water here, who owns the dams, treats the water, transfers it to Melbourne, where you have 3 retailers, City West Water, South East Water, and Yarra Valley Water. They distribute the water to the customers, they collect the sewage, and then they pay Melbourne Water again for the treatment of that sewage. One of the features of this model is that the retailers own the water in the dams. And that's a very important principle, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit later. Okay. The interesting thing here too, the storm water is also handled by Melbourne Water for catchments greater than 60 hectares. Below that, local government still runs storm water. This is in Sydney, there is a catchment management authority, and the same in southeast Queensland, where they have a wholesale water supplier. But their structures are distinguished by the fact that the retailers also run their own sewage treatment. This next slide, I don't want to go through into detail on this slide, except to say that the governance arrangements around the utilities are comprehensive. There's a number of acts and a whole swag of regulations as well that go to govern the industry. We often talk in Australia about light-handed regulation as a concept, but the reality is very different. And I think most utilities would feel that they are over-regulated. Now, the Tasmanian model, this is probably more relevant to what I understand is happening in New Zealand. So in 2005, Infrastructure Australia produced their annual report, and they determined that the water and sewage infrastructure in Tasmania was the worst in the country and was unsustainable. So likely to get much worse. At that time, 29 councils were running the water and sewage infrastructure, supported by 3 wholesalers, Hobart Water, Ersk Water and Cradle Coast Water. So having the Infrastructure Australia report in hand, the Tasmanian government moved quickly to create a new Water and Sewage Act. And out of that act, they aggregated these 32 entities here into 4 entities: Cradle Mountain Water, Ben Lomond Water, Southern Water, each retailers. And then they were jointly serviced by a service provider called OnStream. And the intention of OnStream was to do the joint purchasing. For instance, OnStream would buy 1 billing system on behalf of the 3 utilities. However, by about 2013, it was clear that there were some shortfalls in this model, and the government moved again to aggregate all of those 4 utilities into one utility, which is now TasWater. TasWater is still in place today. So just quickly, not going into any detail on this again, but just to give you a sense of the sort of regulatory structure that sits around TasWater. I really like the TasWater shareholder model. Each of the councils is the shareholder. They have a percentage ownership of the business, and that works very well, much better than the single shareholder model that is very much more common on the mainland in Australia. So whilst TasWater has a very good shareholder model, it's a bit deficient in water policy, with water policy in Tasmania probably 20 to 30 years behind what it is in Victoria and other parts of Australia. I don't want to go through this in any detail. I want to spend a bit more time on the last couple of slides, but suffice to say, when TasWater was first formed, the shareholders, the 29 councils, were guaranteed a certain level of dividend from their ownership of the business. That guarantee was independent of profits, which in retrospect was probably not a sustainable concept. And since that time, the dividends that's paid to councils are now actually a percentage of the profits, okay? Okay, some common features of nearly all of the Australian models. Just about every utility in the country is corporatised. So it operates under corporations law, identical to the law that exists for any private company in Australia. They just about every one of them has a skills-based board appointed by the shareholders. And that seems to work very well. The competition for those board positions is, in Victoria at least, very strong. So you do tend to get very good board members. All of the utilities, well, the vast majority of utilities pay dividends to their shareholders. The state governments generally own the utilities. So the politics of state governments can still have quite a strong influence on the operations of the utility. Every jurisdiction, every state has now an independent price-setting authority, which is often called an economic regulator, who sets the prices based on future investment programs and affordability. Each state has an active drinking water regulator, an environmental protection authority that looks after water extracted from rivers and sewage discharges and dam safety. And I would have to say over the last 30 years, there's been dramatic improvements in Australia. I think the levels of service that are currently delivered, if you go back 30 years, if you're working 30 years ago, the sort of levels of service that are being delivered today would have been undreamt of previously. So the reforms have worked to a very large degree. The scale of change that's occurred in Australia over the last 30 years has certainly been dramatic in some cases, relentless in others. And I think another message for the audience today is this all takes time. And it does take lots of discussion, lots of collaboration, lots of give and take to get to where you need to get to. So some personal views. I think the government needs to be very clear on its strategic intent with any reforms, and this should be reflected in what I would refer to as a utility licence, a licence to operate. That strategic intent should drive both a very active water industry policy agenda, coming from, in your case, I guess, the national government, but also helps to set the operational priorities of the soon-to-be-formed utilities. The corporatised model, I believe, is a great discipline, a great commercial discipline for the utility and for the shareholders. The corporatised model ensures that the utility takes a commercial approach, particularly around ensuring that they've got a sustainable pricing trajectory, that they've got a balance sheet and a level of debt which is sustainable, that they are properly accounting for their assets, including full depreciation and accounting for renewals. All of these things are critical, and if you don't have that commercial overlay, then you can't do anything. If you're not commercially viable, you cannot deliver the levels of service your shareholders and your customers expect. Shareholders should receive dividends based on a percentage of the profits. I don't think the original TasWater model was ideal with a guaranteed level of dividends, but certainly in Melbourne, the dividends are tied to a percentage of the profits. And I think that's another good discipline as well. Shareholders, yes, they receive dividends, but with that dividend and their position as shareholders comes some serious onus as well. The shareholders need to take the time to fully understand the governance model that the utilities operate under. If they're operating under corporations law, then the shareholders need to understand that, and they need to understand very much the price setting process, which is established by the economic regulators. These, in Tasmania in particular, have been practices which the councils have had no experience in. And I think it's fair to say that some of the councils have struggled at times to understand how the prices are set and to understand the governance arrangements and what their levels of control can be under corporations law. But all that needs to be transparent, and the shareholders do need to commit time to understand it. Based on my experience both in Melbourne and in Tasmania, I would strongly recommend that each new entity has more than one shareholder. I think in Tasmania, I do like the model down there where we have 29 shareholders. It requires the shareholders to, come to some consensus. They do receive every year a draft business plan which they approve, and then they actively monitor our progress against that rolling 3-year business plan. That's a great discipline on us. But because there's a number of the shareholders, it does mean they need to act in unison and negotiate, their preferences and their priorities. And I think that's a good discipline for them. And generally, we get the right answer, or they get the right answer. Utility boards, I think it's very important that they're skills-based, not representative. They are running a business, a commercial business, and there's specific scientific challenges, there are health challenges, there are environmental challenges, there are economic challenges. So it's important that you have the skills on the board that can deal with those challenges effectively. To some extent, the shareholders can be representative, of course. So they bring that representative view to the table. Independent price setting. When that first started out in the mid-90s in Melbourne, I guess we were all very apprehensive about it and felt it was all a bit unnecessary. But now I think it's a fantastic discipline and a great process. It makes sure that everything is transparent and and the utilities are accountable. It means that, for instance, the utilities have to go out and consult with customers, get an agreement over the levels of service that need to be achieved, and a price that's adequate to deliver that level of service. Now, all of that information is in the public domain through the price setting regulator's website, it's great for the customers to have that independent oversight of the utility, and it's great for the utility to have a clear plan. I also strongly support comparative competition and the National League table. When I was Managing Director at Yarra Valley Water, there wasn't a day go by that I didn't think about what Kevin Young was doing at Sydney Water or what my neighbours were doing at South East Water or City West Water. And nobody wants to be bottom of the league table, and it is a major spur for innovation in the absence of real competition. It's very important to have well-resourced regulators with teeth. That's essential. The regulators also need to stand up and justify their standards, because they will be major drivers of price increases over the future term, and they need to be able to stand up in public and justify their position. Utilities need to have sufficient scale. This was the problem with the initial model in Tasmania. The 4 utilities that were created in 2009 simply didn't have the scale or the balance sheet to deliver all the services they had to deliver, to support the growth, to subsidise the remote communities and attract good staff. They just weren't big enough. They couldn't offer the salaries to get the right staff. So scale is very important. Another very important factor, I think, is the utilities should own the water in the dams. In Victoria, we call that bulk water entitlements. Those entitlements are tradable, so the utilities can sell them to other parties if they don't need them in a wet year, or they can buy more water in a dry year. But the important thing is that the entitlement to the water is crystal clear. Otherwise, you're going to run into major problems when you have a drought or you have some other incident that creates a shortage of water. I think it's also very important that utilities have some control over land use and water supply catchments. Tasmania, in Tasmania, we don't have enough control over the land use and water supply catchments. So the water quality coming off catchments, particularly those that are intensively farmed, is not good, which means that we have to spend a lot of money on treating the water to make it safe, whereas a few preventative measures at the top end of the catchment could be a better answer for the whole community. If you do decide to go down the route of separating wholesale and retail, like many of the models in Australia, then ideally each retailer should be serviced by more than one wholesaler, in my view, because the wholesaler is a major cost driver in the utility, and it's important to keep the wholesalers on their toes as well. And if you've got more than one, then you can have some comparative competition to keep them both on their toes. And the other advice I would give you is that you really do need to invest in communications. No one else is going to tell your story of reform. I think in Tasmania, we were too late to tell that story. Our customers didn't understand why. It took us a long time to get them on board and to get the levels of customer satisfaction up. So that's the end of the story. The last message I will leave you is reform is a journey, not just an event. But if at all possible, I would encourage you to start with the final destination in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony, for that full and frank assessment of TasWater's lessons learned, particularly the commercial governance framework and the incredible lift in service standards that they've seen. Okay, we're going to shake the format up again and we're going to come back to New Zealand, and I'd like to welcome to the stage now Palmerston North City Council's Chief Executive, Heather Shotter, and the inaugural Chief Executive of New Zealand's brand new water regulator, Taumata Arowai, Bill Bayfield. The establishment of a 3 waters regulator is a big step in the water reform program. Taumata is a term associated with a symposium of Congress, and it involves a sense of protection and wisdom. Aroa means to give attention to or focus, and why, of course, is water. In July, Taumata Arowai was established as a Crown entity with an independent board and a Māori advisory group. And in late 2021, the Water Services Bill, as the Minister outlined, will be in Parliament, and when that's passed, Taumata Arowai will become Aotearoa's dedicated regulator of the 3 waters: drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. Heather is very involved from a council and personal perspective in the whole water reform process in New Zealand, and today she'll be asking the questions of Bill, who joins the agency from his previous role as Chief Executive of the Environment Canterbury. Welcome to you both.
Right, well, thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction, and thank you, everybody, for the opportunity for us to have this discussion this afternoon. Welcome, Bill. So I think we want to start with a little bit of context here, and I want to talk about, just very briefly, why I'm so passionate about this, why I'm so passionate about water. For two reasons. First of all, I'm the chief executive of a growing city in the middle of a prosperous region. I'm very aware of my responsibilities as chief executive to ensure the safe and clean drinking water for our residents, for our visitors alike, and also for the disposal of our wastewater and our care of our stormwater networks, to ensure that we do so in an environmentally safe way and in a way that is cost effective and able to meet those expectations by the ratepayer. And I have to say, I have not met yet a chief executive of a territorial authority that does not take those responsibilities seriously. And also from a personal perspective, I'm extremely passionate about water because I was a resident in Havelock North in 2016. And two of my three children, my two daughters, were at school in Havelock North. And they contracted Campylobacter, along with over 5,000 other people of all ages and stages in life in that what they call the village. And that was a result of fecal matter that got into the Brookvale bore that contaminated the water that supplies the drinking water to Havelock North. 45 people were hospitalised, and unfortunately 4 people died at that time. But many of those that were infected and suffered are still suffering the side effects to this day. And some of those illnesses are Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an autoimmune disease, reactive arthritis, and lactose intolerance. To put that in some sort of perspective, if we were to take that in an Auckland context, over 500,000 people would have been infected. Something like 4,900 people would have been hospitalised, and 430 people would have died. Those are extremely sobering statistics. In August 2017, the inquiry into the Havelock North crisis made 51 recommendations. And one of the 3 most significant of that was the establishment of a water regulator. So the Minister has spoken to us this afternoon about Taumata Arowai being a real-world modern regulator that ensures New Zealand receives safe, acceptable drinking water and helps prevent adverse events such as Havelock North from occurring again. So Bill, welcome. Can you please explain to us what Taumata Arowai is and what it will do?
I think the Minister and Peter Reidy have done it perfectly. It is a recognition arising from Havelock North and the recommendations of the inquiry that New Zealand needed a new approach to water regulation, and therefore it is an independent Crown entity with responsibility for direct regulation of drinking water and, if you like, a national overview over the regulation and performance of wastewater and stormwater.
Right. So you've had your feet under the desk for a wee while now. Well, not that long, but a bit of time. What do you see as the key challenges of the next, say, between 12 months and sort of 5 years?
In the next 12 months, it's the kind of construction of an organisation and providing everybody who is a water supplier and a wastewater and stormwater operator with a clear signal of what is expected of them and of us. Yep. That's the major challenge, and if you think that we have a go-live date at the moment, sort of as a target of 1 July, it's not far to go. I'd also stress that if you've read the Water Services Bill, you'll be aware that it is a very different approach. It is a collaborative, real-world regulator approach where people who take on responsibility for supplying drinking water to New Zealand communities take on a very strong duty of care. And so it is about working hand in hand with the sector and literally lifting all of our performance.
So can you explain the requirements and timeframes for the registration of water schemes?
I can do it easily in terms of the 500 plus people. Simply that anybody who has been registered before will be continued to be registered, and that we will be working very closely with them over the first year as they look to revise their drinking water safety plans. However, this is an ideal opportunity for me to stress that the Water Services Bill is exactly that. Our champion, Nanaia Mahuta, managed to get that introduced to the House on the very last day of Parliament. Pretty phenomenal achievement. And as she said, she's going to get it onto the order paper, and we hope that it'll receive its first reading and go to Select Committee before Christmas. That means that there's nothing definitive in the Water Services Bill. There is an opportunity, and certainly we are exploring at the moment within ourselves and with local government in particular, and iwi Māori, basically how we might handle small suppliers and how we might be that real world regulator.
Yes, so just speaking of small suppliers there, the expectations that are going to be on them. So we're thinking about those smaller water schemes that might just be a country road where there's several farms on it, or how that might work. The
definition in the Water Services Bill at the moment is pretty much anything greater than a house. If you're supplying water to someone else, you're a water supplier. And we have to take that into account, which is why the Water Services Bill allows us to have a fit-for-purpose regulatory strategy, which recognises that Auckland's fundamentally different from Kaikoura, and that a group of batches on the banks of an estuary are very, very different, for instance, from a single farm that's supplying a honey operation, a pack house, and maybe a sort of B&B.
So at the moment, there's a number of conversations that are happening around water. How are you integrating, I guess, your thinking and the conversations that are happening, particularly around productive water irrigation and the concurrent freshwater regulations and how that's seen?
We are only a small part of water reform, and I think the Minister stressed that. So we know that what's coming across New Zealand water sort of business is why is why. And Te Mano Te Wai is therefore governing all that we do. And so we're having to watch very carefully how this next phase of the RMA rolls out in terms of the MPS for freshwater, and where indeed the Randerson review that speakers have referred to earlier take us. We're also, of course, the Water Services Bill and the formation of Taumata Arowai predated COVID and predated the initiative for Three Waters reform, for the service reform. And the Minister talked about three pillars. The first one being the formation of Taumata Arowai, the second one being if you like, the Water Services Bill, which is our duty and functions, and the third one, which is the service delivery reform. So basically we're keeping a close eye on all those, and I suggest that how some of those travel will affect us.
Yeah, and I'd like to come back and talk a little bit about Three Waters reform, but before I do that, the Minister also talked about being Taumata Arowai being guided by a Māori advisory group. So how can you advise iwi to be involved in the shaping of Taumata Arowai, and how is that working at the moment?
I think it's the other way around. I think with engagement that we're undertaking at the moment, iwi are advising us as to how they expect to be involved. We've just finished 20 hui around the nation and learnt a lot, and certainly read our pedigree in terms of New Zealand's performance in drinking water and wastewater, most of it highly accurate. And so I look forward to working with them. Our Māori advisory group and Māori board, and the board have just called for expressions of interest. And so that board and the Māori advisory group should be live, if you like, end of February, mid-February, and that's when we can operate with them and get them to give us the guidance that what we have built into our organisation's tikanga, mataranga, is okay.
Yeah. So let's come back to the Three Waters reform. You're involved in that. You and I both sit on the steering group as part of that conversation around that. Can we talk a little bit about the regulator and how do you see that water reform playing out and your role within that?
I think one of the things you have to recognise is that I sit on the Three Waters Steering Committee, really, firstly as a matter of joy. When I took on the task of being the establishment CEO, it wasn't hard to work out that to work and lift the performance of New Zealand's drinking water in particular required a significant change in the way we were doing things and a significant investment in terms of infrastructure. And I guess that the point being made that if you're going to do that with 67 units of local government, that's going to be quite a huge ask. And so therefore it is, as many other speakers have said at this conference so far, time to look at the status quo won't work, what will work, and therefore the Three Waters reform, the service delivery reform, is a marvellous collaboration between local government and central government to say, we have a problem, how are we going to fix that? I am very biased as to its outcome. The thought of being a regulator controlling 67 units of local government versus a regulator working with somewhere between 2 and 8 major multi-regional entities, I'll take the 2 to 8 anytime.
Yes. So your insight into the opportunity around reform to unlock and enable a significant catch-up. We've talked about, and the Minister talked about as well, about the I guess, years of underinvestment in infrastructure and Three Waters investment. I think we're talking about something like $30 billion. I can only talk from my own experience of our wastewater consent is coming up soon in 2028, and just looking at the costs of the alternatives to treat wastewater for 91,000 people is anything between 300 million and 800 or 900 million. So do the math on that. It's an expensive outcome. So can you talk a little bit more about how you see that?
I guess I'll reverse the insight to start with. And from what I know, and only 6 months ago, I was CEO of a regional council dealing with 10 territorial authorities across Canterbury, all of whom had their challenges. All of them had similar stories to yours. And I guess for me is, if we don't change the status quo, if we don't take this opportunity that is presented, you have to think about where that might place us. And that might place this incredible country that I'm very proud of in terms of what we've done in terms of COVID-19, and put it on its head when a whole lot of people question tourism, food export, and even basic health. How come we've managed COVID so superbly, and yet, as Peter outlined, 34,000 people drink unregulated drinking water every year and get sick?
Sobering statistics.
They are.
Another thing that has been identified through this process has been lifting capability, drive to strategic procurement, enabling improvement in data capture and systems. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I would. Many of the smaller councils in the Three Waters Review have flagged the fact that their capability is not high. They have to access systems that they're not familiar with. And that's not in any way to criticise the people in this room that try to assist them, but it is tough. And I guess for me is, the larger entities should allow a growth in capability. They should allow a growth in industry. This is going to be a growth area. If we look at the Three Waters service delivery coming off, then we're looking at a substantial increase in the people who are involved in drinking water, wastewater and stormwater. Stormwater might take a while, but this is going to be a growth industry for certainly the next decade and possibly the decade after.
I would agree with you. On reflection, we've only got a few minutes, and so we will have to wrap up. But
we can't keep these people from their cocktails.
We cannot. We are. It's between us and the drinks out the back, nearly. But before we do, if I was to talk to you in 5 years' time and reflect on the establishment of Taumata Arowai, you've talked about some of the challenges. What would be the success? What would you be talking about as we've in that 5 years, we've had some key successes? What would they be?
In 5 years, I guess for Taumata Arowai, it would be that we had programs clearly set out and established and a regulatory strategy for how to get there across all three waters. So that would mean drinking water, wastewater and stormwater, all addressed in 5 years. I suspect that to work out the relationships with stormwater and who's going to, if you like, be accountable for what, might well take a few years to kick that off. I'd also like to think that Taumata Arowai was a relatively lean and mean organisation with an army of authorised persons out there in a self-supporting sector that were really looking after themselves. And I guess for me is in 5 years, I hope that there is somewhere between 2 and 8 multi-regional entities that are in 5 years delivering all three waters, but certainly drinking water and wastewater, and that they have really changed the face of kind of the priorities and the investment that's going in. I love the idea of an infrastructure pipeline, because that's really what we're after. There isn't a part of New Zealand that doesn't need significant upgrades, significant overhauls.
Bill, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time this afternoon. You're sticking around for this evening and be available to talk with people who want to have a broader conversation with you about the challenges ahead.
Happy to.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Heather and Bill, and thank you for Heather opening this up from a personal perspective. So it's not just about the assets; it's about our people and it's about New Zealanders. Well, the next speaker is coming to us from Australia again, but this time Sydney. There's not a lot in the Australian water reform that Kevin Young has not seen or been part of. For more than 15 years, he chaired the Water Services Association of Australia's National Committee on Utility Excellence and Asset Management. He's on the board of TasWater and is Deputy Chair of WaterAid. Significantly, Kevin served as Managing Director of Sydney Water for 8 years through significant change and reform. We've been working closely with Kevin in the last 6-7 months, and I think what sets him apart in my experience is his absolute focus on customer, on environmental service standards, and the success the organisations he has have achieved with that singular focus on the end customer. Welcome, Kevin, and thank you for videoing in.
Thanks very much, Peter. And good afternoon. In a short time, I want to provide my personal reflections on water reform in Australia. It's been my whole career. I watched with interest the debate 40 years ago in Australia about volumetric charging for water and how water was becoming a precious product. And with a lot of debate, started in Hunter Water and as an early adopter, and was loved by the community. And then 30 years ago, I rejoined Hunter Water as the first corporation in Australia, the first water utility. And there was a lot of debate at the time. Principally, if you formed a corporation, would they just focus on being commercial? Would they lose the real focus on customers and community and service? Would commercial drive everything else? And there were several features that didn't allow this to occur. The first was they had a diverse skill-based board that realised to be successful, you had to provide great value and service to the community. We had to solve a backlog of capital works, and we had to improve water quality standards and environment. And we had to keep prices under control. So Hunter Water from the start-up had the first operating licence in Australia. It was an innovation at the time. It was independently audited, checked transparently and publicly the organisation's performance against things that mattered to the community. Highest water quality standard in the land had to be met, environmental performance standards, customer metrics, unplanned outages in water and wastewater. And the thing that I recall at the time was that the way it was set up was that there were huge penalties for non-compliance that rippled through the organisation, from a letter of rebuke to multi-million-dollar fines, even the CEO and the board being sacked for continued non-performance, to even the organisation losing the right to serve the community. So given that, every board meeting that I went to had a huge focus on the non-financial metrics before they discussed the financial. It was a real step up in reporting. Honest reporting was critical. New focus meant that all cost streams came under focus. We wanted to do more for the community at the lowest possible cost. And I remember it as an amazing time for innovation, measurement performance, benchmarking, a desire to be the best. I love being part of that business. And I progressed from a lower level manager when I first joined it to becoming managing director in 2004. And I saw, after Hunter Water, corporations being formed right across Australia. And generally a state-owned corporation, but new council-owned corporations came into being in Queensland and later in Tasmania. As my colleague Tony Kelly has said, there was a big debate in Tasmania about the need to reform. And in 2005, I was asked to go to a major conference like this in Tasmania, a similar auditorium, and give a presentation on how Hunter Water had gone with being corporatised. And the question was, if you form a corporation, could you trust a corporation, and would the organisation just focus on being commercial? Now, I went through the archives and I found the slides that I used some 15 years ago in the debate in Tasmania. And I was being asked questions about how the new organisation responded with results in customer satisfaction, water quality, value for money, was the charging system considered fair, and how did the organisation respond to what would be considered a necessary increase in operating costs. And just quickly, I'll share some of the slides I used that day. Now, the first one on customer satisfaction, incredible increase since corporatisation. Customers really found that they got great customer satisfaction because we were talking to them. We were trying to drive forward with things that customers cared about. And so we hit all-time highs. Water is safe to drink. We had problems when we were corporatised, but it was a real focus of the organisation with penalties for not achieving it. We really prioritised our investment to make sure one of the best things we could do was to provide clean, safe drinking water. Good value for money, started off low, we became corporatised, reached an all-time high. The charging system is fair was a huge debate. It went to from lows in the mid-30s to a high of 69% thought that the system was high. And the operating costs, because we looked critically at all operating cost streams and we wanted to find innovation, better ways of doing things, asset management. We wanted to visit best practice organisations. It was just a time when we drove operating costs to provide great value, and shows the typical Australian water industry and Hunter Water at the time after corporatisation, but a 40% reduction in operating costs. And that lubricated the process where we could invest massively in new infrastructure and drive value for customers. Now, looking at the success of water corporations across Australia, what stands out? And diverse skill-based boards, they look equally at conformance of the organisation and performance of the organisation with a real focus on customers, customer at the heart of everything you do. They want you to benchmark. If there's one thing that I'd say I can give advice is form a smaller number of major utilities that are willing to share their results and able to adopt them and drive value for customers. Independent price setting and standard setting with teeth for non-compliance, major focus on asset management. New Zealand's famous around the world for what you do in asset management. And for 15 years, I chaired, as Peter said, the National Committee on Utility Excellence and Asset Management. And I just saw what was able to be achieved with corporations across Australia. Scale is critical. You've got to have a certain scale to get a critical mass of people driving great improvements and investing in new technology and major procurement savings. That scale and those benefits really give value to customers. Incredible accountability increase, incredible change in culture. to have a customer focus, but achievement, teamwork, honest feedback and care. That's a work in progress today. And an ability to benchmark and share across all the cost streams. Now, I want to deal with a couple of myths. Corporations. One is that when you become a corporation, you outsource everything. And it is true that all cost streams come into focus. But it's equally true that what you want to do is work with your workforce to drive great reform. You want a workforce with a culture that says we want to look at best practice and we want to help parts of the organisation to achieve best practice. So while there was significant outsourcing to the private sector, in places like Hunter Water and Sydney Water, and TasWater and Queensland corporations, they still have an in-house workforce for operation and maintenance. And I saw the changes that we did in Hunter Water and Sydney Water, and it's an amazing increase in morale in achieving that. Another myth was that the relationships with unions would be increasingly combative, and that is also not true. Yes, you want to drive change, but I found that when I went to Sydney Water, I wasn't happy with the relationship. The union said that they were the circle of resistance and that we were the circle of persistence, and we were acting in opposite directions. But we sat down with an MOU to say, how do we change for the future? And the things we agreed on is that we want to provide great value to customers, and we want motivated and safe and engaged staff, and we want the business to be successful. So that led a major reform for introducing great change as a partnership of unions, management and employees. I think Sydney Water became a national case study of how that should become. Now I look back to 1992. I joined the first corporation in Australia for it to become the normal model. And there's been incredible water reform. But I just want to finish with a point that I think there's enormous water reform occurring in Australia today. Virtually all water utilities in Australia are looking to become more customer-centric. The vision of the Australian water industry is customer-driven, enriching life. That's why we exist. At Sydney Water, our vision was be to the life stream of Sydney for generations to come, the evocative lifeblood of water within the community, working with the community. And all utilities, Corporations Australia, have a desire to be a digital utility of the future, mass connectivity. And I'm seeing at the moment, it's amazing what technology can do. IoT sensors to detect sewer blockages, water pressure, this is leak detection. And this is an area that's booming, and it's all about scale, having a certain size. Mobility solutions, customer operating hubs, thinking smarter. In 2019, Sydney Water won the award as Digital Utility of the Year, and it won the International Water Prize for Digital Smart Projects. So the scale gives you an ability to drive great value for customers. There's also at the moment a longer term partnership with the private sector in procurement. And that longer term partnership means that you can have time to invest in innovation and driving value with partners that are high quality partners that care about safety and customers. My last point is that what I see at the moment is that water utilities are shifting from a traditional role of master plumber to master planner. And they're increasingly focusing on livable cities and adaptation for climate change. There's an incredible increase in recycled water focus, not of 3 waters, but moving to 1 water in the future. And this requires great engagement with the community and collaboration with councils. And I love the talk this morning that Hamish gave about city planning, and that's my experience. You get together in a collaboration with the city and you say, what do we want this city to be in 30 years' time? And you put in place major place-based infrastructure compacts where you're sharing results on infrastructure for transport, for land planning, for water, for energy, for gas, for waste streams. And that's why you are achieving the outcomes for the future. So there's enormous reform that's occurred over the last 40 years, 30 years, but there's enormous reform that's occurring now. And I think that you need scale to achieve the greatest success by collaborating with others to achieve outcomes. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Kevin, and please stay on the screen. We've got time for a couple of questions. You can hear us okay?
I can.
Great. Look, a couple of questions that have come through. Probably the first one is around culture and people that you've raised. So the question is, what cultural challenges did the water industry in Australia face as it was trying to become more customer-centric?
Yeah, interesting. When I first came Managing Director of Hunter Water and Sydney Water, we did a culture survey where we got the entire organisation to say what's the current culture and what do we want the culture to be. And we noticed that our culture was risk averse. It was all about bureaucracy, not taking chances, low accountability. And so when we asked the organisation, what culture do you want? They said, we want to drive great value for customers. We want to have achievement. We want to work as a team. We want to, self-reflect, and we want to encourage the best. So I got everyone to do in the higher levels of management, going down to level 4, a 360-degree review, and Tony Kelly is one of the best in Australia in doing this as well. So we've done culture work, starts with the MD doing his own 360 review and sharing that with the organisation. And if you want to get real customer focus, you get metrics. Our customer operation hub is getting real-time information from customers as the work is being done, so that people can see in real time, am I making a difference to customers' lives? So you want an organisation with a culture that you care so much about that. You desire it. You want to know. You become so proud of what you're doing.
Thanks, Kevin. I hadn't heard that before, Managing Director being accountable for making a difference to customers' lives. That's good. Just last question, we've got a couple of minutes, is look, take yourself forward 10 years, and if you think about the Australian water sector, where do you think it'll be in another decade?
Yeah, so my great vision for it is it's the digital utility of the future. That you've got a motivated, engaged workforce where you've got mass connectivity. The water and wastewater systems are smart systems that you're using technology to connect with customers, your assets, the best people, and that you're becoming make our vision real, which is to be the life stream of the community. So you actually are working with the councils, transport, gas, energy. And you're putting 30-year plans in place, and you're saying, what cities do we want to create? And the issue for us in Sydney was that our western plains, where our growth was, we know with climate change, they're 8 to 10 degrees hotter. They've got half the vegetation and half the rainfall. And if we want to talk about livable cities, we need to rethink how we do water. Not from a minimum standard of water supply, but really rethinking about recycled water for blue-green corridors through communities, for lagoons, but how we integrate stormwater, wastewater, potable water to make a difference, to provide a cooling effect for those communities, to give kids somewhere that they can play on hot days, get out of the house, get off the Nintendo Switch and play in the parks. Then play rugby and beat Australia. But yeah, so I think the vision is that the Australian water industry changes so that we're just such a critical part of the lifeblood of the city, and we use technology to drive it forward.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for that jab with the rugby. Look, appreciate your time. That ends our session. It's been fantastic. On behalf of Fletcher, thank you very much for Kevin, Tony, Heather and Bill for making themselves available. It's been a really encouraging session. Certainly, I think from a New Zealand perspective, this is an industry that matters to New Zealand. It matters to our growth, and I think what we've heard today is there are some real plans there for the future and some lessons we're learning offshore. Just one thing on behalf of Fletcher, I'd like to have a shout out to the management team of Infrastructure New Zealand. I think you put on a magnificent show. It's been testing, it's been tough, particularly with COVID. I'd just like to say, well done, awesome. We'll have a great night tonight, but thank you very much on behalf of one of your sponsors, Fletcher. Thank you.
Well, hello again, everybody. Thank you very much, Peter, and my thanks to Kevin Young and all of our afternoon speakers, Minister Mahuta, Tony Kelly from TasWater, Taumata Arowai's Bill Bayfield, and facilitator Heather Shotter, the CEO of Palmerston North City Council, and of course to our water reform MC, Peter Reidy. A big round of applause, please. All right, everyone, so now that you're getting good at polls, let's see what you have to say about water reforms in poll 4. If you wouldn't mind opening up your apps and answering the question, and we'll have a look at the results in a moment. While you do that, let's start to talk about our next speaker. Just as we begin to close our afternoon session on water, we've heard from our politicians on the red team, and so we will soon hear from the other side of the political aisle. But just before that, let's see if those poll results, we've got the poll question and poll results. There we go. So what would be the ideal structure for New Zealand's Three Waters delivery? Well, look at that. Okay, so it looks like 2 to 8 independent public trust-owned Three Waters service providers is in fact now convincingly leading your answers there. Thank you for that, everybody. So let's introduce now Andrew Bailey. With a background in infrastructure, he's the new Shadow Treasurer, Revenue and Infrastructure Spokesperson for the National Party and for Statistics. He's here to tell us his views on the next term ahead. A round of applause, please, for Andrew Bailey.
Watch out! How do you hit the floor? How do you hit the floor? 63 Impala, baby, you don't want to know. How do you hit the floor? How do you hit the floor? Building up the spokes. Come on,
Tēnā koutou katoa. It is an absolute pleasure to be here, and I must admit I've got to congratulate you all for your resilience, for staying around. I'm aware that drinks are coming, so I have 10 minutes to gallop through some of the ideas that I've got with regard to this new portfolio of mine. I'm just going to say this infrastructure portfolio, I'm very pleased to be involved in it. Prior to going into politics, I was involved in the private sector and did a lot of infrastructure projects. So it's something that's very keenly held and an interest I have held very deeply. I've taken the opportunity today to sit through all the different presentations, and thank you everyone who made those presentations. They were excellent. I think there's about 4 themes that I particularly want to pick up on. The first one is that we should talk about programs of investment rather than projects. We're rather sequential in the way we do infrastructure projects in New Zealand. The second thing is about creating a culture that recognises and actually incorporates diversity. The third thing is, unfortunately, the construction sector is the sector with the highest suicide rate in New Zealand. And I'm very aware of that from my previous role as building construction spokesperson. And I think part of that's to do with the fourth aspect, which is making sure that in New Zealand we have a pipeline that supports sufficient level of job security. Now, it's clear that New Zealand does have an infrastructure deficit. This is both at central and local government level. In a post-COVID period, investment in infrastructure can and should play an essential role in driving the economy. Future investment needs to encompass both hard infrastructure, and what I mean by that is roads, rail, water, wastewater, and soft infrastructure such as education facilities, health, community facilities, etc. Part of that mix also includes housing, and in particular social housing, which is something that's a pressing need for New Zealand. And the other thing about all this type of investment, it should have a regional focus. And that is required if we're going to have a balanced sort of fiscal approach in terms of delivering an economic outcome for New Zealand. The other critical infrastructure is the investment in our technology. We have a major opportunity with digital technology, particularly in the use of technology that helps with data analytics that make our physical infrastructure perform better. In our election campaign, we pledged $1 billion to improve digital connectivity, particularly in rural areas where a digital divide still exists. And of course, 5G offers that potential to move much more quickly. As a country, we need to grasp this opportunity, and now. Not only is it important for our rural communities, but we need it for our manufacturers and our businesses so they can adopt cloud-based solutions and move towards digital 4.0, commonly referred to as the Industrial Revolution. In the construction sector, of course, it also underpins the use of BIMs, and as Andrew Stevens was telling me earlier, 3D Point Cloud, we were saying that they basically mapped digitally the harbour bridge that was damaged in a matter of hours. And of course, those types of things lead to productivity and will also lead to us ultimately compiling a digital twin for New Zealand. The other major factor for New Zealand is obviously the effect of climate change. And obviously there's been some pretty dire prognosis about it. NIWA estimates if we have a sea rise of 1 metre, and at the moment we're hoping we're going to limit it to 0.5 metre at most, 125,000 buildings in New Zealand would be affected, and that would cost, and current cost, about $38 billion. The other big thing is water, and I'm glad we had quite a series on that before. Water is a strategic asset for New Zealand. We receive lots of it, but unfortunately we only capture a very small portion of it. The continuing improvement in our water quality and resilience of our catchments and waterways is a core value of most Kiwis. Given the investment required by councils, particularly in water and wastewater, the government, central government, has a role to work in partnership with local councils. My old firm was directly involved in trying to merge the water assets of the Waikato, Hamilton and Waipa water businesses, and I personally think that is a good model to be looking forward to in the future. But we do have some concerns and some worries in New Zealand, and I think the first one is we've got a capacity constraint. We do have a limited capacity to undertake multiple projects at once. This means that central government should be clear about its plans and ensure a continuous pipeline of works exists so major contractors and obviously their subcontractors can resource accordingly. It also implies that local government must be in the mix, undertaking infrastructure projects at a regional level using local contractors. It's no use just burying our major contractors and not actually dispersing the investment across the regions. Now, of course, the Infrastructure Commission will go some way to achieving this, but I do personally believe that the role of the Infrastructure Commission could be further than just setting out a 30-year plan, which is its initial purpose. I tried to get inserted in its remit or its mandate that it should also take on the role of one of reviewing completed projects for those that have been performed poorly, so there's some learnings out of that, as well as highlighting the projects that are being done well, and there are learnings for those for the rest of the industry. And I think the other thing that the Infrastructure Commission could do, because it's got that long-term view, is to look at the assessment of the future needs for new skills in the building and construction and infrastructure sectors. And by doing that, I think that would be helpful in terms of identifying those gaps in the skills that we all know are looming. And of course, in the construction sector, areas like project management are a major concern. The other thing, there's been a lot of talk today about getting projects underway and the so-called shovel-ready projects. Given the significant debt on the government's books, which is increasing, it is important that future infrastructure projects deliver discernible benefits. So-called shovel-ready projects should not necessarily be undertaken just because they can occur quickly. Future projects need to be assessed whether they first of all facilitate economic growth, and a good example is the rollout of broadband, employ significant numbers of New Zealanders, and that's why building construction projects are a very good example of that, specifically meet a benefit to cost return, so there is some form of financial or economic gain. And the last one is to act as a catalyst for other developments. And the case in point, I think there's a lost opportunity with the Dunedin Hospital. That should have actually been a project to recatalyse or rejuvenate Dunedin. But it was seen simply as a very large hospital build, and it's good for achieving that outcome, but in my view should have been used to look at how we were going to change the retail sector, how we were going to deal with accommodation in Dunedin, particularly with 1,000 workers. There are lots of opportunities to leverage that project. The other concern I have, and I've seen this at a personal level, is our procurement processes and our ability to execute well. On the whole, we procure poorly in New Zealand. We're too focused on short-term costs, and we do not adequately take into account whole-of-life costs. This means that many of our suppliers and manufacturers in New Zealand are disadvantaged when there's a low bid, and as a result, miss out on the project, when in fact they shouldn't, when you take into account the high ongoing maintenance costs and other such costs over the life of the project. Earlier, before the construction panel was set up here, talked about contract arrangements, and there's always been this issue around mismatch of risk and how those contracts are structured. The last thing I want to talk about is funding and financing. We are open to most forms of funding, include direct pricing, toll roads and user charges, as well as value creation and capture, usually through the land development associated with infrastructure investment. I was involved with the review of the CRL some years ago, and I do still believe that was an absolute loss of opportunity in terms of using private sector money to help facilitate and fund that project. And if you go to Australia and England, of course, the ability for them and the opportunity that they've done to capture some of that value upside, I think we need to be much more focused on achieving. Also, I think there's opportunity for green and social infrastructure bonds, and there's a strong argument, I believe, with the low rates of interest, that we should be locking in very long-term funding arrangements that will keep us going over the next many years to make sure there's absolutely certainty around the cost of funding. I'm very conscious that I'm between you and drinks, but I hope this short summary gives you a bit of a snapshot on our thinking around infrastructure and building and construction. I just acknowledge you all in this room. You play a vital role in terms of delivering not only infrastructure in the physical sense, but the community aspects that come out of it, and all those wider perspectives that make New Zealand such a great place. And I just recognise you and thank you for all you do. Ngā mihi, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew Bailey. Lovely to see you. So, team, we have made it halfway, nearly. The party is about to start, though. A big thank you to all of our speakers and sponsors who have provided such insightful content today. Please, another round of applause. Now, before we wrap up proceedings, a few reminders. Firstly, you will have received your table seating instructions through the app push notification, also via email. So please check the list displayed on the screens in the cocktail function for your table number. Any questions, just see reception. Secondly, we're going to be moving into the exhibition hall for the INZ cocktail party, but we have a lovely wee surprise for you. We have a new gin bar this year by the Emerging Talent Ping Pong table on the ground floor. So you won't be able to forget that. At 6:30, we'll be starting the BNZ Gala dinner. So please don't dilly-dally when you get the call up, because our MC for the evening, my mate Reidy, will be rearing to go. The Anderson Lloyd after, I love how you guys have so many parties. The Anderson Lloyd after party will begin at 10 p.m. and that's going to end at midnight. Shuttle buses will be available, and of course your Uber discount vouchers will be valid for 2 trips. You'll find the details on your lanyard. Just please travel safely. And finally, a look ahead to tomorrow. We're looking at improving housing, data and digital infrastructure, and the GHD workshop on visioning kicks off at 8:30 a.m. So have a great night, but do pace yourselves. Thanks for joining us here today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. There's 850 of us today. I said this morning it was 800, but in fact it's another 50 on top of that, so it's pretty fantastic. These gatherings aren't just an opportunity to share ideas, but they're really to drill down on those issues that need resolution, that need challenging, that need a fresh and innovative approach. It's a chance to truly challenge the status quo, and you guys have done that. And of course, it's a much needed chance to just spend time together in this climate. That's a real treat. So I look forward to seeing you bright and early tomorrow morning at 8:30. But thanks again for a great day, and do have a great night. Pō Marie.
I bring the flavor like yum noodles, the groove guru, the flow hold, peak the style, yo, I'm on the roll like long bows, I'm all go, stay in your lane like cornrows, I bring the funk like Bootsy on the baseline, if she is a moving or the booty is a hate crime, I hear Marvin, you hear it through the grapevine, great minds, same page, same vibe, just hit the wall, the world keeps spinning like a disco ball, mind the intro, coincidental, I bring the hype from New Zealand to Japan and San Francisco more, suave than a gourmet entree, more heat than a hot girl when she saw me.